Good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Mosvik, and I am the Buckley Legacy Project Manager for the National Review Institute. And appreciation for everybody who has come to the webinar today, to our donors, our supporters, and our subscribers who are joining us for this discussion of Anglo-conservatism in the post-war period. So just as a little bit of setup, what we're thinking about here, what we're trying to do and accomplish. We're thinking about both anti-communism itself, which was this very important glue in bringing together that post-war conservative movement, especially here in the United States under Bill Buckley, and the figure of Winston Churchill himself. Buckley actually had an opportunity to see Churchill speak when he was a student at Yale. And Bill had admiration for Churchill, but also had talked about how he failed to stop communism. So there's a very interesting thread there in terms of over the Atlantic. So that is what we're going to focus on today. And for those of you who are with us, if you have any questions about Bill Buckley or National Review and this subject, I'm happy to field those questions once we get to Q&A. But having set up all that, let me introduce you to our two speakers today who will be taking you through this important subject. So Andrew Stuttaford is the editor of Capital Matters here at National Review. And Daniel Pitt is a research fellow at the University of Buckingham. And Daniel, I think, will share more, but he has recently set up the first university center for conservatism in the UK. So hopefully he'll have a little bit more to add about that, but that seems to be an exciting and important uh, piece of what he is doing over there. So with that, I'm going to let these two gentlemen take you through everything that I have to say, and then in about a half hour, we will start Q&A. So start sharing those questions as you have them, and we'll take the discussion from there.
Okay, well, shall I kick off? I hope everyone notices that we have in our studio here in National Review, New York, we have Bill Buckley looking over more or less my shoulder, and Dan has Winston Churchill looking over his shoulder. So that is very appropriate for today's discussion. These two great men and two great wordsmiths as well, and different overlapping eras, and but both understood communism, reacted to it in slightly different ways. One was a spokesman for, or a man pushing the ascendant, or the power that had already ascended. How was it going to handle communism and indeed socialism? And Churchill was in a different position because, much to his regret, he was the last lion, famously, and he knew that the glory days of the empire were over, and that Britain's role as a world power was shrinking. And so he had a different challenge to Buckley. Nicholas mentioned that Buckley had his differences with Churchill. I mean, expressed as a difference. I might say, speaking of personal contact, I performed as an extra in the movie Young Winston, and unfortunately, my face is just a blur. Actually, perhaps fortunately, my face is just a blur. What is interesting about Buckley is, as he is, if you read his obituary of Churchill in '65, it's fairly critical. Which is when Churchill died. It's fairly critical about particularly not doing enough against socialism and so on, and also effectively about Yalta. A little harsh. And in later years, Buckley changed or moderated those views somewhat, I think, as his own experience grew. And he came across He made a wonderful speech to the Churchill Society in 1995, and and in the aftermath of it, he was driven home, and the host said to him, and this is, I think, such a Buckley answer and so marvelous, said, you know, and then and sorry, not when he was doing it, he was, this was in public, and of course Buckley was famously quick, and the interlocutor asked, Mr. Buckley, if you had Churchill to yourself for one evening, what would you say to him? Bill Buckley, and this must have been the only man ever that he said this about, said, I would say, please talk nonstop. So that is Bill Buckley from 1995. So Dan, we talked a little bit yesterday. Can we talk a little bit about the challenge, the landscape that Churchill had to face in, should we say, just before the 1945 election, which was a watershed election in Britain, when the Labour Party, under Clement Attlee, won an enormous victory. And Churchill was beaten and sent yet again into the wilderness. His wife actually rather hoped it would be a long-term vacation/retirement, but Churchill had no interest in that. And but the world had changed from 1939 within Britain, and Churchill had a very different world to deal with. Maybe you could talk about that, Dan, a bit.
Thank you, Andrew. Before I move on to that, I just want to remark about the wordsmith, that they were both verbal craftsmen, and they both understand the importance and persuasion of rhetoric. They're both rhetoricians, and the rhythm of the spoken word and the written word, and they were both brilliant at that in their own ways. It reminds me of a quote from Orwell about political chaos is connected with the decay of language. And I think both Churchill and Buckley can teach us about the importance of language, both written and verbal. And hopefully I'll give you a few quotes from them as we go along. So Churchill comes in as prime minister. He's not elected in. He comes in. He takes in a crisis, the Norway crisis. And the last election was in 1935. The Conservatives under Stanley Baldwin. And so there is an election for 10 years. They keep being postponed. Parliament keeps voting to postpone them. And in between this time, when the war starts and the election in 1945, there was a truce of some sort between the parties. And the two parties interpreted this slightly differently, but the truth was that they wouldn't compete against each other. For example, if by-elections came along, so because there was no general election, it would essentially, the status quo would be kept in place. And the Conservative Party essentially became moribund, especially at the local level. They were not raising money. They were not being active on campaigning, gaining voter information, and so on. And the Conservatives also interpreted this as that the intellectual debate essentially needs to take a back seat. But the left and Labour didn't interpret this in the same way. They thought that having the debate, the intellectual debate, would continue, and they did. The left also, Labour kept to their promise of not fighting by-elections, but the left outside of Labour, they set up a new party to contest by-elections, and they started to win these elections. So when the election came round, the Conservatives were hugely defeated, and they people didn't expect this coming. They thought Churchill would win. He's this great world statesman. It was very much about Winston Churchill and about him rather than about a platform moving forward. So they were hugely defeated in this, so win for Clement Attlee's Labour Party. Clement Attlee, of course, was Deputy Prime Minister under Churchill during the coalition of the war years. There's one speech that some people refer to, which they say this had a negative effect on the election, but I don't agree with that. But I think it's interesting from the communist perspective. So it was called, people now refer to it as the Gestapo speech, and it was delivered on the 4th of June 1945. The election was in July. So let me just pull out the bit that people point to, but it's really interesting about socialism and also what's happening in Britain today about free speech. And I quote, "No socialist government conducting the entire life and industry of a country could afford free, sharp, and violently worded expressions of public discontent. They would have to fall back on some sort of Gestapo, no doubt very humanely directed in the first instance." So people take umbrage at the word Gestapo, secret police, that was used under the Nazis. But actually around this time, people started using this Gestapo term for anybody who was a busybody. So it was actually used quite frequently. Even some conservatives referred to the whips and the whips office as Gestapo. So let me just move on to the rest of this quote. And this would nip opinion in the bud. It would stop criticism, reared its head, and it would gather all the power to the supreme party and the leader, rising like stately pinnacles above the vastly bureaucracy, administrative state stuff of civil servants, no longer servants and no longer civil. And so you can see this, he goes on about socialism as well. No doubt that socialism is inseparably woven with totalitarianism. Liberty in all its forms is challenged by the fundamental conceptions of socialism. So you can see why the left don't like this speech, and you can see why they would jump on this word. So this was one area of what people say this was a huge mistake by Churchill to make the speech in this Gestapo. One thing I find really interesting is that the reflection afterwards by Sir Joseph Ball. He was the director of the research department. This is very important at the time, Conservative Research Department. Lots of great minds go through it. And he wrote a memo for the party afterwards titled The Defeat of 1945. This is an internal memo. He doesn't point to that speech whatsoever for the reasons for the defeat. I won't go through all of it, but he points to cheap books, Guilty Men, Your MP, which ridiculed conservatives during the interwar years. Very interesting, he points to the Workers' Education Association, who are in charge of educating people in the military and saying how left-wing the lecturers were. Newspaper propaganda, Daily Herald, Mirror, others. And also the BBC. The BBC, this is interesting today, would promote lectures by socialist thinkers. And also the left were very good at using speeches in the House of Commons, which then the BBC would promote, and so would left-wing newspapers. So it's very interesting that this internal memo, straight after the Conservatives' election, thinks that these are the things, the reason why they lost is because BBC, the left-wing press, and the Conservatives just did not fight the intellectual battle during this period.
I think that's very true, and I've never read that. I just wonder, you taught me yesterday about the Gestapo speech, because I just knew it asked the Gestapo speech, as most people do in Britain. And it's very interesting how you can sell and distort the message of a speech, or distort the message of a speech by just taking one line out of it. But the wartime propaganda, the way that wartime propaganda was primed, and I told Dan, and I apologize for this, for repeating it to you, but I was watching many years ago, they were showing a series of old British propaganda films from the early 1940s. And I mentioned it to my mother. I was in my flat. She said, "What are you doing?" So it was raining. And I said, I'm watching the telly. This on Channel 4, they got this British propaganda film. She said, well, we didn't have those. That was when the Germans did that. And I said, no, we had them too. And then the next week or two later, I was staying with my parents, and there was another one of these on. And I said, yes, now, do you want to watch it? Yes. My parents were interested in history. And at the beginning of it, you saw various stock characters appear, including a member of the upper classes. And I said, I can't remember if it was he or she will be the traitor, you see. And at the end of the speech, there was a lot of talk about the great new world that was going to be built, and it was very much a socialist vision. And the other thing that I've seen, I don't know whether you've seen this, Daniel, but I no reason you should. It's something I read years ago, was that people think that, firstly, there was the worry about Churchill, the warmonger, which you and I talked about yesterday. Maybe you could talk
Yes.
about that a little, but also the mere experience of living in something as collectivist as the army and a highly regimented society, but which was fairly unified, was itself a collectivizing experience, even
Yes.
without the propaganda. Do you think there's something to that?
Yes, that's really interesting about because what was Churchill's reputation at the time. People tried to do there were two reputations, or at least people who tried to make it out that there were two. There was Churchill, the world statesman. He was the great hero. He won the war. He brought the Allies together, United States, and pulled in the distance from France and from Norway, and brought the whole allegiance allies together. So this is the great Churchill. But then they tried to picture Churchill as two other ways too. Interrelated. There was Churchill the warmonger. He wanted war. He thought war was positive. This is what they're saying. I'm not saying this is true, but this is what they painted. He loved war. This is where he thrived on it. This is where he wanted continuous war. This also links straight into of course, the Iron Curtain speech. But there was also the partisan leader of the Conservative Party, Churchill. And this is what Clement Attlee tried to do during the campaign, is he tried to say, cheer Churchill, the war statesman, but vote for us, not for Labour, not for Churchill, the partisan conservative. So you've got these different conceptions of Churchill competing out there in the political debate. Churchill, the world statesman, Churchill, the warmonger, and Churchill, the partisan conservative.
Yes, I think that's true, and they, in a sense, tried to put him on the trophy shelf, and said, he's built the war, or he built the victory, and some credit was given to the Americans and the Soviets, but he's built the victory. We'll build the peace. That was very much the message. So if you look at young Bill Buckley, of course, came from an America First, an isolationist sort of more perspective. He wasn't particularly, interestingly, Anglophiliac in his youth, which Bill Rusher put down to him being Irish, was the explanation at one point. And so if you look at the opposition to socialism, one of the very interesting things that I hope that Daniel you will expound upon is how there was more of it going on in Britain than is popularly remembered, really from the late 40s and the 50s, before you then had the definitive show with Thatcher. But it essentially was a sort of British concept of liberty, sort of infused with the likes of the Hayek who were hanging around. Whereas, when I say hanging around, they were in the UK. Whereas Bill Buckley, who of course abandoned isolationism, but his route was also more of a continental route to how he also was also, I think, influenced by his Catholicism, and so they were different types of conservatism. And would you think that's fair?
Yeah. So usually the narrative is that during this time in Britain that there was the post-war consensus and dominated, therefore, in a type of socialism. George Nash, of course, in America, his great book, seminal work, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America since 1945, he pinpoints 5 different traditions going on from 1945: the libertarian, traditionalism, anti-communism, neoconservatism, and religious right. And you can actually see many of these. Of course, Bill Buckley's great achievement was to amalgamate these, or to fusionize them, especially the anti-communism, the libertarian, and the traditional. So you can see these also in Britain during this time. Well, we have similar actually names, but some of them slightly different, like the One Nation tradition or Tory democracy. One Nation was actually coined by Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister in the 20s and 30s. It's normally referred to Disraeli, but he referred to in his novel Sybil, Two Nations. And then Stanley Baldwin said the reason why the Conservatives exist is to unite those two nations into one nation. So you can see that, which is Churchill sits in that to a certain extent. Then you can see the traditionalist conservatism, interested in Christianity, the Anglican Church in particular, monarchy, imperialism, the empire. And you can also see like proto-Thatcherism, or you would call in the United States Reaganism. So the Bow Group was set up and founded in 1951. You can see who is somewhat a politician who's far more famous for a controversial speech on immigration, Enoch Powell, starting to come round to this classical liberal case. And then you can also see books being republished at this time. Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution of France, became very, very popular, again, republished in this time. The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, but was originally published in 1944, but also during this time became much more, the calculus debate started to come forward, the knowledge debate within prices and markets that essentially cut this argument very simply and short, is that prices have knowledge embedded within them. There's no way that bureaucrats could be able to know the price of something. So it actually doing so diminishes the knowledge that these prices have. So this was out there. Quinton Hogg, who was a conservative politician, better known as Lord Hailsham later on in life, he wrote The Case for Conservatism, which had a traditionalist wing, but trying to make it more pragmatic towards the day. R.J. White edited a book trying to say that conservatism had long and deep roots. In a way, it's quite similar to The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, except that this was an edited version of people's speeches like Burke, Disraeli, Salisbury, and emphasized continuity, organic change, and respect for institutions. So actually, many of these things were still going on during the war and after the war, but get overlooked or forgotten in many ways, because the narrative, because people look at how the outcome came, they forget there were actually many people out there and groups, not so many books, but pamphlets and groups. Just a couple of others you could see, like Buckley. He referred to himself in God and Man at Yale as an individualist. So at this time, it was also used in Britain. Ernest Benn, who was a publisher, took over from Benn Brothers. He was using this term. City of London, traders, these type of people were using this term. You can see Richard Weaver's work and the Southern Algarians. There's also an Algarian tradition in Britain. Arthur Bryant, who's a historian, would advocate these. You could see paternalists thinking that industry and government should work together. So Lord McCohen, who was in charge of the imperial chemical industries. So you can see these threads, just as if in the United States, when you had Weaver, many of these people crossed over, of course. Like Hayek, he was in both countries. He was read by people.
Yeah, I think it was the Reader's Digest actually, which did an enormous amount to publicize him, if I recall. And
Precisely.
then the other thing, there's pamphlets and there's books and there's experience. What we forget, Reagan in many ways had been thinking his thoughts and then was propelled into office by the dismal failure of the 1970s. The first wave of the rejection of socialism in Britain came through people liked a lot, too much, obviously, of the Labour Party settlement of because Attlee was trying to really rebuild the foundations of the country. I mean, he was a very mild-mannered revolutionary. He was a war hero in the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
God-fearing man, a decent man actually,
Mm-hmm.
and but so people liked a lot of what he did, such as the so-called RNNHS, but the socialism was beginning to creak a bit already by 1950, and Labour
Mm-hmm.
just scraped in,
Yes.
because the deprivation of socialism was already beginning to bite. I mean, I forget the exact figures that as to who had less rationing, whether it was the Germans or the Brits by 1950.
Yeah.
And then the Tories, the final heave did it in 1951, and then you saw the Conservatives basically living with the settlement,
Yeah.
but gnawing away here and there, but not enough. But they stopped the rise,
Mm-hmm.
and but it was a job half done. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there were the ghosts of the future, such as Enoch
Yes.
Powell on economics with Thornycroft, people like that. And we had to wait for another bit of lived experience, and that was the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
70s and catastrophe.
Yeah. Yeah. What's interesting about Churchill, that he was asked that what was his domestic policies when he got back in 1951, and he said two things on the domestic front: meat and housing. Meat and housing. And if you think that in Britain, rationing was still in place, the last remnants of rationing left in 1954. So you've got the war ended in 1945. 9 years later, after the end of the war, Britain is still on rationing. And that is because the socialists thought it was an equalizer. And there's a nice little story about Churchill when he became prime minister. He asked someone to go out and do some research on what the rations are, what is on the ground. And this chappie comes in and it's painted on, it's on a plate, because not using the actual food because it was rationed. And Churchill remarks, that's a decent size meal. That's a decent no, Prime Minister, that is for the weak. And then he said, the British people are starving. We have to get rid of these rations. In 1954, that was domestic. Of course, his foreign policy was communism related, and the relationship with the United States and so on, keeping the British Empire as much as he could.
I mean, what do you think of the criticism of I mean the original Buckley, and it always continued, was over, of course, over Yalta, but my own view is that obviously not a fan of Yalta, but there was very limited at that point. The people running the show were the Americans and the Soviets, and
Yes.
the French were only invited along, not to Yalta, as a courtesy. They were given a little slice of Germany,
Yes.
but the Brits were, however many compliments were paid to them, with the junior partner. You then fast forward to the early 19, but Britain joined NATO, and what was interesting about that was a cross-party thing. There was a big chunk of the Labour Party supporting
Yes.
the Foreign Secretary called
Yes.
Bevan, who was very
Mm-hmm.
pugnacious, important man, and a lot of great comments about who we had in NATO. Attlee's comment as to what about Turkey? Everyone raised their eyebrows. What, Turkey?
Mm-hmm.
And he said,
Mm-hmm.
well, I'm not going to say exactly what he said, but he said, I fought against that lot Gallipoli. I'd rather have them on my side than against me. And so Britain was very much in militarily in the Western alliance, of course, which Churchill favoured very much so. And he was not naive about what communists, Czechoslovakia fell in 48. That was the sort of the final catalyst. Yet we have Churchill, the man who loves the sort of the shrapnel and the whiz of the bullet, there's various quotes, sort of a bit of a peacemonger in the early 50s. What's going on there?
Yeah, so Churchill, of course, sees communism and Bolshevism, calls it disease in the 1920s. He sees this early. And he was very much against communism in the early 1946. And you can see this in his what we now refer to as the Iron Curtain speech, which actually called the Sinews of Peace, which is interesting because he gets called a warmonger for this by many, which was not received with open arms by everybody at all. Labour and the government back in the UK were criticising him from warmonger. The people in the United States also was calling him a warmonger and wanted to bring the United States into another war going in. So there were others who, of course, said it was a great talk, great speech. So the big difference, and it's around about 1949-ish, you can see, but really at the pinpoint Churchill changes is when Russia get nuclear weapons. That's the turning point. And his position starts to change from being essentially he wanted to crush Bolshevism, communism in its cradle before it even he wanted. In 1917, he wanted British Army to go in and crush it. So he was not in favor at all. But he started to change around about 1949. But when he became prime minister, he changed to wanting to have a summit, what he called an East-West summit. And he wanted to get people around the table to try and reduce the threat. He realized that this was an incredible threat to humanity. Interestingly, I've always thought that this latter Churchill position is very similar to Ronald Reagan's position, especially when he met up in Reykjavik and with Gorbachev. So it's interesting that if you could perhaps look back and see that's Churchill's latter 1950s position, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, Churchill was obviously, and we have to remember, in the early 1950s, he was born in 1874. He was a man who'd taken place in cavalry charges.
Yes,
And Omdurman, one of many prime ministers there. There's the future prime ministers there. There's an interesting trivia, including Gandhi. I think that I suspect that he was, without knowing, he ideologically had no doubt at all that communism was wrong. He never apologized for supporting Allied intervention against in the many Russian civil wars that there were. Woodrow Wilson, by the way, let the side down, I might add. Not for the first time, but not for the last time. And but he was also concerned about the practical realities of what would it be, because I mean he knew Stalin well enough to know that he was capable of pressing the bob if he had to, or if he saw advantage of doing it. And do you think that it was just he thought, well, we don't really have the in us to play the long containment game, which, thanks to the US, both in terms of its ideology, and in those days a very different Democratic Party, and also its strength and its willpower, was able to provide. Do you think he thought we're not going to be able to stick this one out?
I think that he was thinking that it's better to cut people out. I always thought the route of Parliament, of course, is about talking. And people forget that he used to say jaw, jaw, not war, war. Get people around, get them discussing, and he thought that we could solve our issue. So I think that's what the one element. That all changed from that point onwards. But of course, Churchill at this time he became prime minister again. He was old. We got to remember that. He was unwell. He had strokes. He was not a young, energetic man. At this time, he was becoming hard of hearing in cabinet. Some people say selective hearing as well, when he used to go through the voting lobbies, they hear the things that he wanted to hear and not others. So he wasn't this energetic youth. He was no longer the Churchill of the war years. Also, you got to remember at the end of the war years, he was absolutely exhausted. And he said to his wife, Clementine, that perhaps the election was a good thing, because if he had won, he would have died in office completely exhausted. But his foreign policy had three levels at this time, trying to keep the empire together, the association with the United States, and to create a united Europe without Britain in. He was very, 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 very clear about we were a buttress, not the cathedral. So he was very clear. One point I like to raise that people forget about this in the Iron Curtain speech, that it was about freedom, first of all, and the Iron Curtain, which people remember, but about the English-speaking peoples. I think this is an interesting quote. But he said, "But we must never cease to proclaim in fearless tones the great principles of freedoms and rights of man, which are the joint inheritance of English-speaking world, and which through," and then Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, habeas corpus, trial by jury, the English common law, then listen to this bit, "find their most famous expression in the American Declaration of Independence." And in his work published in 1956, it's called A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. And you think, well, he's just saying that to an American audience. But in 1956, two-time prime minister, and I quote from his book here, "The Declaration was in the main the restatement of the principles which had animated the Whig struggle against the latter Stuarts and the English Revolution of 1688. So you can see that he's trying to embed this into a Whig tradition. It's very Burkean sense, and Russell Kirk would argue that it was a conservative revolution to keep a tradition, not to overthrow one. So you can see this in Churchill's Fulton, Missouri speech, which is what gets left out, I think. And then he talks about the fraternal association of the English-speaking peoples. And then he uses that famous phrase, which is very much used in the UK, not as much used in the United States, but is used in certain sections, about the special relationship between Britain and the United States. This is one of his highest priorities of foreign policy at this time.
And it was one that he literally incarnated. I mean, his mother was American. He used to point out that she claimed, I don't know, she's not always a reliable person, that she had ancestors that had fought in the Revolutionary Wars, as they say here, and said that she would wave the stars and stripes in the face of him and his brother as children every 4th of July. He was very proud of his American heritage. He was British intellectually and traditionally. He did not get on very well with TR, for example. That was just really too much. Which I have to say I have a degree of sympathy, but but he did see the world. He saw it was a form of soft power, and it was later on to be diminished again in the war, in the struggle against communism. There was the conceit of Harold Macmillan that Britain would, and I don't think he was necessarily the first person to say it, but that Britain would be Athens to America's Rome, which I think Americans would think would be rather patronizing, and Americans would be quite right. Churchill, I think, saw something rather more muscular, but
Yes.
it was something that transcended conventional alliances, and you can call it the special relationship, you can call it what it were. And one other thing about him, and he wasn't a peacenik or a peacemonger or anything like that. It was he always, though, and it was his blunders are military blunders, which are a couple, are misunderstood typically. But for example, when the Soviets were pressing hard for a second front as soon as possible, Churchill famously said, I think in cabinet, he did not want this to start until we were going to win. And he said, we've had the Somme already once. We're not having it again. And he knew the cost of war. And I suspect that hung over his thoughts about nuclear weapons.
I agree with all of that, and it's also very interesting that some conservatives at this time, because they were thinking which of the totalitarian regime, communism or Nazism, and of course they saw them as essentially the same blossoming of the same roots of the totalitarian regimes. That let them fight it out, let them destroy each other. These are two awful, godless, materialist regimes. Buckley used those terms, godless, materialist, communism, that just did not. They just did not, as Buckley would say, it didn't. It was a threat to individual liberty, up from liberalism. Of course, he critiqued liberals' complacency towards communism, and he thought it was antithetical to the American tradition in this way. And he saw it as anti-communism, a unifying force, that it could be a rallying point for conservatives. And that was the same in Britain. It was actually a quieter rallying point, but it still was a rallying point. In 1951, the year that God and Man was published by Buckley, there was a great scandal called the Cambridge Five in Britain, where two of leading Cambridge academics went over to Moscow in the same year, which Burgess and Maclean. These were spies, 5 spies, and they defected. And the Conservatives used this. Churchill used this to capitalize on the unease with Labour, socialism, and creeping totalitarianism.
So, I'm going to intervene, gentlemen. Sorry, just a note. It's 2:43. We've got about 17 minutes left here, so I think we want to try to take a couple questions if we can. It's been a great discussion, but I just want to make sure that we take a couple questions. I think that's an interesting place to start off too, Daniel, just in terms of another issue that Bill Buckley brought up in terms of this early anti-communism and conservatism, which was the security problem. His whole second book is really actually about this. McCarthy and His Enemies is really about the security problem, particularly in the State Department, but beyond that, and that itself may have some implications for what Britain was dealing with what you just mentioned in 1951. A real part of the force was that there was a genuine domestic threat as well as international threat. So it wasn't merely a thing of fighting an abstract notion of communism or idea in globally, but rather actually an insidious evil that presented itself everywhere.
Yeah. So this was one thing that slight with you had McCarthyism, the book, as you mentioned, was written on it. Britain did these type of things as well, knowing that it was internal. So they would do checks on civil servants, for example. They would tighten those checks. The Conservatives used it, anti-communism, in the 30s and also in the 50s to combat this. And of course, then it was found out that there were spies working for Moscow. Academics at one of the top universities in the country, Cambridge. So this caused a great stir that communists were not just over the seas, but also right here at home. And that was a similar thing. The hiss was also happening in the United States as well. And so that you can see the comparison between the two, and how communism played a big role in binding conservatives. But also, many socialists also denounced communism. I quoted earlier George Orwell, for example. We conservatives, we like to quote him and so on, but he was a type of socialist, but a socialist who was against totalitarianism and communism. So there was cross-spectrum agreement too.
I think that there was an eyes wide, the eyes had been opened. The Labour Party and Clement Attlee was there. They held a banquet to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1937. It would have been inconceivable, I imagine, that they would have done that in 1947.
Yes.
They were capable those days. They were Democrats, small d Democrats. Churchill's point about the incrementalism of socialism is, of course, well made, and of course one that Reagan understood very well. And I think that sort of where Thatcher and Reagan came from. I mean, the catalyst. The thinking had been going on, and I think this is the point that you've been making, is that we know much more. I mean, Buckley did it much more as a conscious exercise, and there was a lot of people going, and then he was trying to turn it into a political mechanism. There was already a Conservative Party, whereas what you needed in Britain was the double combination of the failure of the Conservative Party and the ideas that were floating around. And so Reagan emerged from the confusion of the 70s, but he was already there in 76, nearly in before Carter, which should be remembered. Whereas for the Conservatives and he had Buckley, of course, an absolutely critical figure. They'd already had Goldwater as the dummy run, and very early. Whereas with Churchill, with the Conservative Party, they needed in a sense, they needed a Conservative failure. They had the blueprint ready, but they had to show that the old ship was completely unseaworthy. In fact, it had been lost with a lot of hands. And that's what happened between 1974 and 1979. The Heath government ended in fiasco, and then 5 very constructive years spent in opposition.
All right,
what's really interesting?
I was going to look at the Q&A to see if we could throw in another question here from her.
Go on. Yeah.
That we have here. I think a nice short one that can follow on some of what you guys just talked about is, what do you think about Evelyn Waugh's criticism of Churchill and his criticism of Western policies in Yugoslavia? Now, for everyone watching, Evelyn Waugh, which I'm sure you both can explain, was a rather notable English novelist and conservative who, in fact, had an exchange of letters with Bill Buckley over the years. Evelyn Waugh actually had a couple pieces in National Review early on, and they exchanged in particular about this question of what to do about the security problem. So I don't know if you guys want to take on that question, but I think that that's a very interesting transatlantic figure, if you will, in this period of time.
I mean, Waugh was he was also interesting. His attitude to rationing was interesting. There is an infamous and accurate story that the first time that the bananas arrived in the Waugh household after the war, everyone was excited until Dad just ate the lot. So there we are. He was his own man. He of course knew about Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia had been sabotaged from Cairo by the SOE there. Philby, who was another of these spies, was probably involved with that. Yugoslavia was one hell of a mess, frankly, as to who supported who. But it was allocated at Yalta primarily to the Soviets, and of course Tito then went and did his own thing, having killed vast numbers of people. Maybe Greece was perhaps the real moment of truth, which of course War knew about as well, and where the Brits were very heavily involved, and the Americans and Truman, and that became the line in the sand when they realized just doing nothing wasn't going to do it.
Yeah. Well, I agree with everything Andrew just said there. One, I think, interesting thing about War is that he wrote Bridehead Revisited, which essentially introduced people or reintroduced to Catholic thought, or a revival of it, and an aesthetic and so on. And you could see that also during this period that C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity was published again. So this revival of Christianity, William Temple, a former Archbishop of Canterbury, had his Christianity and Social Order republished. You've got Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, famous Hobbit, coming out here. Had letters to young churches by Phillips. So there was you had the idea of university republished, John Henry Newman, which has been in the he's been in the news recently. So you could see that there was this growing a sort of wider conservative movement worried about culture and religion. So I think he sits in there as well. That's all I can really add to what Andrew has already said.
I'll note too that T.S. Eliot, I think at least uh, he may have been an early subscriber, or Bill may have tried to get him to subscribe. And in any case, they also had an exchange of letters. So Eliot is another figure in this period of time. So,
Exactly.
which is a great
Yes.
reminder that that National Review aimed to not just be a political magazine, but a cultural magazine. So they very much wanted these figures, and many of these men of letters were European or had come over. So this is it's
Yeah.
a fine
I mean,
reminder
I think Buckley
of that too.
understood the I'm sorry there, Nicholas.
No, no,
But
no, please.
Buckley we always talk about Breitbart, Andrew Breitbart, as politics downstream of culture. I think was his quote. But that's basically what Buckley understood extremely well, really from the get-go, actually.
Yeah, indeed, indeed, and yeah, like I said, I think that it's a great reminder that this conversation, while anti-communism is this important thread, um, part of what they're also talking about was a cultural force, right? And a cultural
Yeah.
fight. I mean, Dan, you mentioned even um, a socialist like Orwell. Orwell had written in praise of James Burnham's managerial revolution, and then Burnham
Yeah.
was
Hmm.
inaugural editor of National Review. So there's a thread here that cuts across
Yeah.
a lot of
Well,
a
well,
lot
well,
of
well, well
different lines. Because go
I,
ahead, yes,
I
yeah, go
mean,
ahead.
think about. I mean, I think one of the great strengths of Buckley, which Churchill, who embodied within himself about a million contradictions, but one of the great strengths of Buckley was he was Catholic with a small c as well as with a large c.
Yes.
If you look at, and that's something that Churchill, if you look at his war cabinets, where there was talent, he took it, and
Hmm.
he wasn't too worried about what had been before. And so it was with Bill Buckley, to his immense credit, that he had people who, would have made McCarthy faint. This is the sort of well, forget Whitney Chamber, but and others, former Marxists and Burnham and all the rest of it.
Hmm.
And I think that part of Buckley's genius was the realization of these people who had come to the same conclusions, but
Yes.
perhaps by a rather different route,
Hmm.
had something to bring to the party.
Absolutely.
And that is something that Churchill would undoubtedly have. He liked ministry, well, the British phrase, ministry of all the talents. And I think Buckley did very much, and Churchill would have done too.
Hmm.
And
Agreed.
it's the Lincoln, the team of rivals is the phrase that Americans use too, although that's giving too much credit to Doris Kearns Goodwin. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to bring another question from the audience. It's a short one, but a good one because it's very much in line with where Churchill has been in the news recently, which is sort of this recasting by some. I think the questioner put it as fringe, but in any case, is the villain of World War II. So we talked a little bit about, at the beginning about Bill's criticisms of Churchill, but of course those criticisms were particular, which is there's this that failure to really stop communism. I think that's different from the recasting of him is maybe a potential villain during World War II. So I don't know if you guys want to take that on in the last 4 minutes here, but that might be a nice way to sort of wrap up thinking about why Churchill remains this important transatlantic figure for conservatives to consider, especially in terms of statesmanship.
I think then I'll pass to Daniel on this. I mean, the criticism of I know exactly the most recent criticism of him as the great warmonger. It wasn't him, of course, that declared war on the Germans. That was Neville Chamberlain, that notorious warmonger, and they were in many ways presented with, by that point, very little choice. I mean, there's a long debate, too long for 4 minutes,
Hmm.
about how and why it got into war. Britain got into war when it did, and how they mishandled the phony war, in my view. But the Churchill Churchill's critical moment was, we don't have an alternative, because there was what Mrs. Thatcher once referred to as a moment of going wobbly. Um,
Hmm.
should they make Halifax PM? No, Churchill, and he said, we're either going to go down choking in our own blood, or we're going to win. And an
Hmm.
integral part of that was that America, in the end, was going to come through. But was he a warmonger? And the idea of him as some great villain, I think, is nonsense. But Dan.
Hmm. So as we've only got 3 minutes, I will use Churchill himself to say that this is nonsense, that he was the villain. I think it is hardly possible to state the opposite of the truth with more precision. So utter nonsense that he was the villain.
Fair enough. Well, we have 2 more minutes. I think the last question that came in was about the liberalism or the non-conservative aspects of Churchill's career, but that's a great question, but I don't
One,
know
one,
that. Go ahead. Go
one,
ahead.
I,
If you want to
one,
lose the
I
last two
think,
minutes, please do.
Yeah.
yeah. One interesting thing for that is that Churchill, of course, was a Tory until 1904, and then he came back to the Conservatives in 1924, became Chancellor 5 years under Stanley Baldwin of the Exchequer, um, and he said, "It takes one thing to rat, but it takes another to re-rat." So he left the Conservatives, joined the Liberal Party, became Home Secretary in the end, so high up. You can't get much higher, great state of office, and then re-ratted back to the Conservatives. He was a fusion of Tory and Whig together, or if you want to put it as sort of the Liberal and Conservative together. He supported the empire, but supported the welfare state, these sort of things. So he had a liberal streak going through his thought.
But he wanted to win. I mean, remember the famous Buckley line: "Who do you vote for? You vote for the most right-wing candidate who's going to win." And
Hmm.
Churchill would have understood that, undoubtedly, and his intellectual, he was a sort of a Whig, really fundamentally a sort of Whig, and but the Liberals, which was what was left of the old Whigs by the early 1920s, were dead in the water. And
Hmm.
so he was confronted with an ascendant left-wing bloc, which he saw as a much greater threat, and he went to the right place to deal with it, basically, as he saw it. And Buckley would have done the same.
Seems like a fair place to end this great conversation. Thank you very much, Andrew and Daniel for leading us through all of that. And I appreciate everyone who brought comments and questions forth. We had some great ones in the chat. And thank you all for coming today and supporting us and listening to this great conversation on Winston Churchill, Bill Buckley, and the transatlantic conservatism of the post-war period. All right, and we will see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.